Now, so we'll get started. My name's Darryl Perry. I'm head of UK research here at Avison Young. And I'll be your host for this afternoon's SPR session on the future of our cities. I hope you're all having a really good start to the new year, certainly given the circumstances, and that you're all very much staying safe. And we really thank you very much for joining us today. What better way to spend your lunch break than discussing the challenges faced by our cities in which we've spent our time working, shopping, and generally having a good time. I think some of you will be probably old enough to remember, and some may not believe me, there used to be a time when people used to go out to cities, not only to work, but, to shop and go to places like, pubs and restaurants, theaters, museums. It was wonderful. I know it's very hard to believe now. Flippancy aside, though, after a year's pause in which I guess the way in which we live our lives has really changed in quite a significant way, and we've seen a bit of a rupture. It does raise a number of questions around the future of our cities, the future of our towns, obviously the future of our real estate, and really the economic vitality of the places in which we live and work. And if we think about the changes that we're seeing around how we shop, whether we go to the office or not, and even where we live, and there may be some of you who are dialing in from your new abode in the Lake District or the Shetland Islands. But all of these are very much live topics, and we're going to address what some of this means for our cities and for our real estate. In terms of today's session, I'm delighted to have a wonderful panel of Andrew Carter, Chief Executive from Centre for Cities, Paul Sargent, Chief Exec from Queensbury Real Estate, Sienna Golan, Assistant Vice President in DWS Group, and Chris Murray, Director for Core Cities UK. I'll give the panel a chance to introduce themselves shortly, but in terms of the format, today's session will be a panel discussion. We'll be taking questions from the floor, so I'd encourage you to put your questions into the chat and we'll put them to the panel in good time, although I do have a few of my own too. But first, I just want to set out a bit of context. It's worth remembering what economic powerhouses our cities are. London alone makes up 24% of the UK's economy. The core cities and regions, and to have Murray representing, making up an additional 26% of the economy. These are really the lifeblood of the UK and where a lot of the wealth of this country is generated. In terms of the work we've done at Avison Young, last year we built our UK Cities Recovery Index, and we really did that to monitor the speed and trajectory of what we considered, of what we were hoping would be the recovery in the UK, in London, and our big nine cities, which corresponds very closely with the core cities. And what a recovery index does is uses a large selection of high frequency economic indicators to really track our markets and cities on a daily basis, essentially in real time or as close as we can to it. And what we found as a surprise, albeit a pleasant one, is that by tracking our cities in the way we have across different parts of the economies, whether that's on retail and leisure, looking at how people are moving in terms of footfall or getting back to the office, all of these different metrics that we've tracked as part of our recovery index really shows an incredibly strong correlation with the growth of our economy on a national scale. And the correlation that we've seen has enabled us to, and I don't want to show off here, really track that monthly GDP in real time. So really, what that's done for us is really highlight the potential that getting our cities back moving really has on our markets and on our economy. I spent most of my January touring, unfortunately virtually, the UK cities and looking at what 21 has in store. And there's some good news to be had. Our recovery index showed that when people could go back to cities, particularly in the summer, when restrictions were loosened, they very much did. And we continue to see a number of businesses commit to taking office space, albeit in much smaller sizes than we are used to. We continue to see some development come to the market, especially on the residential side, and there's been some relatively good news even on the retail side as well, where we've seen little pockets, I guess, of vitality, of people getting back and shopping locally, and businesses adjusting to the new way of kind of living at the moment. And this is being done on a wider scale as well. We're seeing governments and cities come into play about responding to these challenges, whether that's through the concept of the 15-minute city, or the recovery funds that are actually coming through into the local economies now. And it's worth remembering that our cities have seen challenges before, certainly to their attractiveness, whether that's through natural disasters. I'm thinking kind of San Francisco, obviously the plague or the Spanish flu, which decimated London's population, or even 9/11, which is a more recent example where we saw commentators really keen to point out the demise of tall buildings and large cities. It's not to suggest, however, that there aren't a number of question marks around our cities, and here's where today's session really lays. The situation we found ourselves that millions of people, it's shown that millions of people can work from home, and at least in a short-term period, be relatively productive. And as a result of that, we're seeing a lot of businesses rethinking their requirements in terms of the real estate that they want. Our research suggests that 70% of occupiers expect their estate to change, and the disruption we've seen in the retail sector is significant and quite long-standing. Debenhams, Arcadia, the stories at the moment, and they account for over 750 stores in the UK, but there will be more to come. So the issue we have today, and the challenge to the panel, is if we take all of these things into account, and we take the idea that there will be less people in our cities, there'll be kind of less people going to the office or shopping. Does this mean that our cities become lesser places? Does this mean that there are less people in our cities on a day-to-day basis, less people in employment? And if it does, that's obviously a significant structural change. So that's a pretty big challenge to the panel, and I think we'll get onto it. I think we'll get into some of those challenges and issues in quite a big way. So I've said we pulled together a great panel. I'd like them to introduce themselves. If we could start with you, Andrew.
Thanks, Daryl. I'm Andrew Carter. I run the Centre for Cities, which is an independent think tank that looks at the economic performance of our biggest cities and towns to understand what's going on, and then to try to devise policy for national government and for cities themselves to improve their overall economic performance. Thank you, Andrew. If we can move on to you, please, Paul.
Hello, everyone. So Paul Sargent, I'm the founder chief exec of Queensberry, and at heart I'm a developer. For all my career I've been a developer. Queensberry's been in existence now for 10 years. It's a development management company. It focuses across all sectors, residential, healthcare, retail, food and beverage. It focuses on urban centres. We are totally focusing on a city centre first approach. And our two key areas of activity are public sector, very clearly split into public sector and private sector clients. With the public sector, we work hand in hand with the public sector on major regeneration projects in town centres and city centres across the UK. Those are primarily financed by local authorities where they are located. And in the private sector, our private sector clients are normally the owners of sort of individual assets, and there our role is much more to repurpose and redevelop the assets, having taking into account the rapidly changing environment that we find ourselves confronted with today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Chris, are you okay to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so Core Cities is it's the 11 cities at the centre of the largest economic areas outside of London, and we collaborate on economic and social policy, and our job is to try and work with government to improve those policies and improve outcomes for businesses, for citizens, visitors, and so on. Previously, done a lot of work in regeneration and with the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environments. This conversation is really interesting to me.
Thank you very much, Chris. And Sienna.
Hi, I'm Sienna Golan. I work at DWS, a global asset manager, where I primarily cover the Southern European markets and a large proportion of transactions relating to offices. We recently completed a piece of research looking at the vulnerability of cities across Europe to a rise in home working, which I'll be talking about later.
If we can pick that up maybe straight away then, Sienna, are you okay to tell us a little bit more about that work in terms of kind of the resilience of that office sector, and I guess what your findings are?
Yeah, so we looked into 10 of the most important gateway cities across Europe to find out which are most likely to be vulnerable to a rise in home working, looking specifically at the office sector. And we looked at two broad sets of factors in our analysis, one relating to employees, how likely they are to want to work from home, and employers in terms of how likely they are to want to reduce office space in response to a rise in working from home. So to give you some examples of the employee factors we looked at, commute was one. It was something that came up repeatedly in surveys as something that's important to employees. But we also looked at the ability per employee, depending on the type of sector that they worked in, to work from home. From an employer's perspective, the factors that we looked at were more relating to the economic cost or benefit of office space. So for example, some cities where office space is very expensive and you also need a lot of it per employee fared less well in our analysis. So to give you some insight into what we found that certain cities like Barcelona fared very well because they have short commute times, and from an employer's perspective, the office space is quite cheap at a European level. London actually fared well from an employer's perspective because although office space is relatively expensive, the output per employee in that office space was quite high. And also after a decade of increasing office density in London, each employee required less space. But from an employee's perspective, London has one of the longest commutes in Europe, and that's a barrier for employees wanting to go into city centres to work. So I think overall there are changes coming for the office market, but those changes are unlikely to be experienced in the same way everywhere across Europe.
Thank you. Thanks, Sienna. If we can move on to you, Andrew, and kind of the issues that were raised by Sienna. Now, obviously, there have been clear and I guess relatively obvious benefits in terms of cities being in the best places to work, in terms of agglomeration of services, clustering, I guess productivity and innovation. There are more real places which enable that. In terms of kind of where do you see as what's your view on kind of the home of cities being the best places to work? Have all of those benefits just vanished overnight?
I wouldn't have thought so. I may well be wrong. I think we're at a moment in time, I think, where we need to be very careful about some of the kind of bigger, grander claims that are being made that are based on really short run effects of the pandemic. So we have obviously seen significant rise in home working through the pandemic. I don't think that tells us very much really about where home working will settle after the pandemic. It'll probably be more than it currently is. But if you think that currently it's around 5 to 10%, if it doubles to 10 to 20%, that's still not very much of the urban population that could work from home. So the fact that we've seen large amounts, up to 50 or 60% currently doing that, doesn't, I think, tell us very much about where we'll settle in over time. So that would be one kind of observation I think we should be mindful of. And just to give you variation, so we look at, as I said, the 63 biggest urban areas across the country. You know, people talk about London. Obviously, everybody likes to talk about London, and places like London and Edinburgh, Brighton, right? You know, they've got a lot of their workforce can work from home, you know, very close to probably 50%. But you go to places like Burnley or Stoke, right, you're going to be talking about 15 or 20% of their workforce that can or are working from home. So again, you know, let's not get carried away about the extent to which home working applies to lots of places. It applies to some very specific places, but even then, probably not as much as we would anticipate, or at least what we are led to believe by those that push that particular agenda. And then my second observation would be, you know, when we're thinking about the future of cities, is, you know, we need to be mindful about, obviously the pandemic has had quite a significant effect on all urban areas across the UK and across the globe. You know, London has suffered more than, in fact, in some respects through COVID than some of our other bigger cities like Manchester or Sheffield. But the difference was that prior to the pandemic, London was in a much stronger position than even places like Manchester or Sheffield. So you have to also understand what was going on before the pandemic to have some sense as to what these, you know, what's the notion of recovery is going to be. In a sense, if Manchester or Sheffield or Mansfield or Burnley recover back to pre-pandemic levels, that's not a great position to be in, even if they achieve that, which is debatable. So again, there's kind of, you know, there's lots of things going on that we just need to be, you know, to be mindful of when we talk about this kind of homework and experiment. It doesn't apply to the majority of the economy, and certainly not to the majority of the workforce. And so we just need to be careful about those kind of conversations. The pandemic doesn't tell us as much as we would maybe anticipate about what will happen over the longer term in a more dynamic sense. So that would be my opening gambit, really.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. Chris, if I can kind of move over to you and really kind of your view in terms of where, you know, picking up Andrew's point around kind of where some of the cities in the core cities collective were mentioned there, where you think this leaves, where this leaves them.
Sure, I agree with a lot of what Andrew said, and I think that there are some other dangers, I think, in just accepting that some of these things will just happen. So, for example, if there was a major shift to home working, then it's not certain that would be people working where they are now. That actually some of those jobs could become very vulnerable if they're totally disconnected to place and could simply move abroad, or, you know, out of the country altogether. I think some of the trends in terms of trends that have been accelerated are, you know, I think we can see some of those clearly. New trends, I think, are very difficult to see at present. But then there's nothing really, I think, in the evidence to suggest a kind of wholesale resorting of the economic geography, but there will be some adaptation, and cities and city centres in particular will need to adapt. So I think, just to answer your question, I've framed that in short, medium and long term. So in the short term, I think once we're able to do so, clearly we need to think about how to reactivate urban centres, and it will require time to understand how to do that differently in each place. We'll need to experiment to work out what works, and to think about things like meanwhile uses, extending some of the creative pedestrianisation that we've seen, cultural animation. Once we're able to do that, to really just sort of begin to rethink the experience of city centres, and to support places as they go through that process. And then in the medium term, I think the approach to recovery has to take place in a place-based manner. So that's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's playing to the strengths of each place. It's not centralised. I think we've seen the limits of that approach in the health response to COVID, and I think it would be a mistake to follow that through into the economic response. But places, you know, even if they've got a strong vision for their future, it would be wise to have another look at that in the new context. And then also to have the ability to align the different bits of the jigsaw around that vision. So thinking again about brownfield, the sort of incentives that will drive that, local financing mechanisms that you might need in place to do so, creating the new skills that we'll need in the labour market and that people will need, linked to stimulus and job creation to drive growth sectors so people can get jobs in those sectors, and so on. Those basic things that we've been talking about for quite a while that I think can happen through pragmatic decentralisation. Of course, we'd like to see devolution, but I think pragmatic decentralisation can happen quite quickly to drive that. And then finally, in the long term, we probably need to rethink what we mean by resilience in the context of people as well as place, and very obviously population health, but also how people connect to place, what their relationship with it is quite a deep level. And there's been a sort of severance between people and place in terms of the pandemic and lockdown, and likely to be a pent-up desire to reconnect. But people will also have seen the weaknesses of the urban experience in terms of things like space and amenities. And I think we'll want to therefore reconnect in a way that meets needs that we're much more aware of now, and to state the obvious, that makes them feel safe. But that I think is actually a really exciting conversation. It's where, you know, far-thinking property developers, designers, urbanists have been thinking and talking about for a couple of decades now. But it's become, I think, fundamental as a cornerstone of future success for places. And the kind of work that you know, Centre for Cities have been talking about, I think that Queensberry have done in Sheffield, are clear examples of that we need to build on.
Thank you very much, Chris. A lot of interesting topics and issues that I'm keen to come back to shortly. Once again, I'd kind of encourage you to keep the questions coming in through the chat function if you do have any for any of our panelists. Paul, if it's okay with you, I'll just stick on this kind of the concept of I guess where we work and maybe take a different tact. I think one thing that we've seen evidence of is that there's probably some demand for increased elements of flexibility where possible, at the point that Andrew raised in terms of the people who can work from home and who can't. We're seeing, we've done a piece of work on called Fit for Future, and that suggests that, you know, that surveyed, I guess, surveyors in charge of occupational estates, and that suggests that 85% are looking to make their occupational estate in some way, shape, or I guess in some way, shape, or form more flexible. We've seen it with Standard Chartered and IWG, but we've seen a number of kind of discussions around this work near home concept. How do you think that works, and what do you think that what do you think the impact that is that could have on our cities and our places?
Just before I go to that point, I had several eloquent speakers before me just giving their summary of where we are. And I'd just like to add mine to that as well, because I think there's been some very good points raised. And I just want to highlight, I 10, 15 years ago, I mean, my main focus in life, I was a retail developer. We built major urban regeneration schemes across Europe, and they were retail led. So I'm used to hearing and seeing change coming up on the horizon, and markets start to change and the internet appear, and never knowing quite where things are going to end up, and having to adapt in that environment. And I think it's you know, I agree with Andrew. You know, he says we have to be very careful about all the knee-jerk reaction and snap analysis of what's currently going on and how the world might change dramatically. It's a moment in time, and I don't think a lot of some of the challenges that are being presented are going to happen overnight or are going to necessarily happen to the same degree. And actually, we were already having this debate, Andrew, Chris, myself, many other professionals in the sector, about cities changing before the pandemic came along. And there were already a lot of debate about what they would look like, what the mix would be. There were already a lot of private investors, institutional investors changing their investment strategy. I remember long discussions with Aviva at the time, 3 or 4 years ago, where they were saying they were going to only focus on 3 or 4 cities in the UK, that they had a national coverage, and they were going to be moving out of cities and probably only invest in places like Manchester and Bristol and London, and there would be multi-sector investors in those cities rather than being the traditional institutional investor that was a retail investor across the whole of the country. So this is a trait and a tendency that's been on the horizon, like the demise of high street retailing, for some time. So mindful of the moment in time and how we assess what's going on at the moment. And again, with Chris, absolutely agree with everything you said, you know, in terms of how we are rethinking, how the whole industry is rethinking its involvement in towns and cities, how we reshape them. The biggest word we're using at the moment at Queensberry is how we reshape. There's a lot of rewords, regeneration, redevelop, refurbish, repurpose. They all mean the same thing. We are reshaping, but reshaping for us is far more important, because reshaping doesn't really just talk, or doesn't want to just aim at the physical buildings. It aims at the community and the people, the spaces between the buildings, and also the financial solution as well to achieve that reshaping. I think the biggest thing that Queensberry is seeing, and we deal across the country on all sorts of projects, but we deal with that other 50% we're not necessarily covering in detail today, which isn't London at 24% of sort of generating in terms of GDP, or the top core cities for the other 24, 26%. We deal in that other 50% as well. That can be sort of the Coventrys or the Sunderlands or the Nuneatons, etc. And the problem is the same for medium, small-sized towns and cities as it is for some of the bigger ones. And I think it's really important that we are looking at a solution across the board. We are looking at, obviously, tailored solutions in each different location with its different requirements, but community and civic pride is fundamental to re-establish. I did spend 15 years of my career working in Europe. And when I came to the UK in my mid-30s, I was quite surprised actually how deteriorated then many of our towns, or the UK towns, were. I always was looking at it with fresh eyes. I'd not lived in the UK. And when I used to travel around the country, I was quite surprised. And that was in 2003, 2004. So these are problems that have been here for a long time. They're being accelerated by external impacts, internet, COVID now. And I think we really have to have the debate around what these new towns and centres look like. They're not going to disappear. We are, by nature, human beings, gregarious. We want to meet, we want to go out, we want to socialise. We know it even more so now and miss it. We don't want to, I believe, all work from home for the rest of our lives. There's too many issues related to that in terms of being shut in the same space all the time. Mental health. We want to be in communities. And I think that's very important. I think the trend behind, just to finish off, that was always already here, which affects how institutions will be managing their portfolios, and this massive change, or 85% change of use. We were already moving towards, everybody wants a more sustainable lifestyle and a better work-life balance. And the pandemic is highlighting many of those things which are priorities to us, to people who hadn't even really sat back and thought about it, or had much time to think about it. And I think we really need to see that tendency is the tendency to follow. How do we make our places more sustainable? How do we suit them to our lifestyles? It's not about working from home or working in the office. It's about whether your office can be in a smaller town, or your company could actually bring investment to a location that wouldn't have been considered in the past, because it is a smaller town with an easier commute, which has already been raised, and is nearer to green spaces at the weekends for leisure. So I think there's a massive challenge here which we can debate. And I think that institutions and private investors will have to look at their portfolios, and there isn't a quick solution here of getting out of the portfolio you have. It's about repurposing, looking at the trends, redeveloping, and exiting in certain locations, and maybe finding new opportunity. There is opportunity here.
Thank you, Paul. We've had a question come through, which leads on from this, and perhaps if we can maybe start with you, Andrew, on this. It's from Simon Durkin. Just picking up on the point Paul made around kind of repurposing, reshaping, etc. How should we be thinking about a value? Should there be great emphasis on kind of quantifying that social value element that I guess we were already seeing pre-pandemic?
Yes, I mean, I think there's been sort of a long-standing recognition that trying to capture and understand those broader issues and how we value them, is a challenge which we haven't yet fully resolved, but one that we need to continue on. You've seen some of the noises around rewriting or revising the green book that the government uses to inform its investments, to try and better capture some of these this broader sense of the values. I think everybody recognizes they're important. The challenge for us is ultimately how we quantify them in a way that is meaningful. And Paul undoubtedly can say something about how then that gets translated into asset values and balance sheets and investment decisions and all the rest of it. So, I think everybody agrees that we need to appreciate the broader values, but I think it's trying to get beyond that, which is the challenge. Some of the ideas in the Green Book are welcome, and we probably need to push them a little bit further.
Are you okay to pick up, Paul, on that?
Yeah, again, use the public sector example to move into the private sector impact. Gross value add, which I think is what we're referring to here from the public sector perspective anyway. And as a sort of private sector, I've only learned about that probably in the last 3 or 4 years, is a way that local authorities, government has of evaluating these secondary factors that do bring true value. And that's fantastic, because investment decisions that they make will be putting heavy emphasis on job creation, on improvement in rateable values that will be received by the council, by improvement of well-being, etc. There's criteria as raised by Andrew. The private sector probably doesn't have such an easy set of criteria when it's talking to its shareholders and its board members. It's more about hardline profit, and the secondary impacts obviously are very nice, but they're not quantified in the same way. That's not to say obviously the sustainability agenda now is high up on all of the major corporate agendas, and it's moving across to the smaller entities as well. I think the thing is, as we change our town centres and we change our cities and we look for new solutions, I think what I'm promoting here is that don't underestimate the power of a new player on the block, which is central government through local authorities supplying funds to enable and support economic development. It's always been there in the past, and we've always had access to certain funds or certain ability to create joint venture with local authorities, but it's going to be a major change in our marketplace over the coming years. We see it already in places like Sheffield, where we're working, where the council is underwriting a development for their town centre, for their city centre, of almost £400 million. The thing to do from the private sector is align yourself with your local authority, engage with them like you would with a business partner, and look for the ability and where you can leverage with the council access to funding, or where you can piggyback on a halo effect of local authority spending to enhance the value of your assets. I can't say it any better than that. At the moment, there are certain sectors which are not viable in the development market, and therefore that development is not going to be carried out by the private sector. It's going to be carried out by the public sector. The public sector is getting more comfortable with that, albeit very nervous now with additional borrowing and additional financial implications with COVID. But that is the medium-term foreseeable trend in the development of our medium-sized towns and cities, as far as we see it. And if you have your private sector investment with assets in these locations, do not dismiss the ability to partner and to engage with your local authorities.
I completely take the point, Paul, and it's one well made. I think you touched upon an interesting point there, where you talked about kind of that value from both the public and the private sector, in point of view. Much of this will be kind of dependent on getting people back in, on attracting people back to these places, or newly attracting people to these places. Maybe if we could go back to you, Sienna, in terms of kind of the work you did around kind of employees' desires, what were the kind of the key aspects that you picked up on, if there's anything kind of new around, what people want to go back to and how they want to spend their time, basically?
So I think the research that we did didn't look so much at employees' desires. It more drew conclusions from other research that's been done in this area. But from that, we did notice that, first of all, commute is very important, as I mentioned. But also other research that we looked at was the CBRE Millennials Survey, which looked at what young people want from a workplace. And what was quite interesting about that is that most of them wanted to work in a city centre. The desire of young people to be in these central areas is still very much there. The other factor that is important is also residential factors. For example, the rate of overcrowding, which can make working from home quite difficult. And to return to the London question, in London, many young people would share a flat, so it makes home working more difficult, and therefore offices, central areas and places to spend leisure time more important. So I would say these factors actually suggest that city centres will continue to be important from an employee perspective, but particularly from a young employee's perspective.
Okay, so maybe if we can come to you, Chris, and really just kind of, there have to be reasons to get back to the cities, and I take the relatively consensus view that we don't believe that the panel doesn't seem to believe that there's a significant drop off in the numbers perhaps going to the city, or at least that is still to be played out. But what other kind of attractors are there, or should there be post-COVID, in terms of making sure that people are getting back? And I guess, what can the real estate sector do to enable
Sure.
that?
I mean, I think what we're talking about essentially is not really getting back to cities. I mean, the role of cities stands. What we've got is essentially an issue with city centres and how we sensibly bring those back into active use, understanding some of the changes that were taking place anyway, which have been accelerated, that we were going to have to deal with anyway. But fundamentally, where else do we go? What alternative have we got to cities? And the rural lobby should really be arguing very strongly in favour of cities right now, because our urban population is about 50 million in the UK, and what do you call a village with 50 million people living in it? Certainly not a village. So I think this is about sensibly mitigating changes that largely we were facing anyway. And I think, if we're honest, we probably had not done enough to deal with over the last couple of decades. So when we talk to investors and developers, that they say predominantly two things to us. The first is that we want to understand what the values are and the value mechanisms that you're working with in relation to your cities. I think Paul's set that out very well, actually. And the second is, we need to have confidence. We need to have confidence to invest. And what are the things that will enable that? And interestingly, a lot of people have said to us they would like to see a high level commitment from government to the future of cities and city centres, because some of the messaging has been a little confused. Not about the home working issue. I think it's a different issue. It's about the relationship between towns and cities, and the levelling up agenda. And I think there's a political reality to that, which is, if one looks at the political map of the UK, and that's just a reality that we accept and deal with. And there's an economic reality, which is that a lot of those places have been left behind in fact, and that needs to be dealt with. But what none of that understands is the way in which economic networks operate, and in and around cities and economic ecosystems. Places are not economic islands, and you can't just go to, you know, one area, whether it's in a city or a town, that has, let's just say, been left behind. I don't like language particularly, but and invest in that place, not understanding its links to other places. And that is fundamentally something that we've got to go back to in policy, is understanding those economic networks within a small country and how they relate to each other.
Thanks, Chris. Is that? Yeah, are you okay to pick up on that, Andrew? I know.
Yeah, I was just going to come in. I mean, Chris makes, as always, make a great bunch of points. I mean, I would say in a broader sense, you know, we're fair. I mean, this is about the role of cities in the national economy that we should be mindful of. Chris is right. We should not be ambivalent about the situation that we find ourselves in. We are pretty clear, because the evidence is pretty large, that there are real gains to cities and working and operating out of cities. The literature is very large in terms of the productivity gains that we get from urbanization and from our city centres, and that has a direct implication for standard of living in this country. What is very unclear at the minute is whether those productivity gains can any way be captured or replicated by working from home. Right? No, not much evidence yet, because there hasn't been much home working. So, you know, we have to be very careful of just assuming that we're just going to drift into this home working sort of scenario and there will be no losses as a result of that. That's not clear at all, particularly when we worry about the innovation and the high productivity end of the economy. Cities are particularly effective as innovation hotbeds, as productivity hotbeds, right? If we lose them in that sense, we will lose innovation gains and we will lose productivity gains. Unless someone tells me that home working can capture or replicate those kind of things, I remain very skeptical about that point. So we should not be ambivalent about the future of our cities in the way that we seem to at the minute. Second point I would make very briefly, just to your point about this, you know, it would seem to me that there's a bunch of places, I'll give you one example, Newport, randomly off the top of my head, right, where there is too much retail relative to consumer demand in that place, right? If you go into that city or that, you know, there is far too much retail relative to consumer demand. And therefore the question for us is, how do we repurpose, remove retail relative to that place? I'm using Newport. There's a whole bunch of places that Paul will know very well that applies to across the piece. And that's harming the functioning of that place. And we don't have the mechanisms to allow that to happen. We don't allow the market in some respects because of the way leasing works and the way that business rates works and the way the prices work, to effectively allow that market to recalibrate back to where it should be, firstly. Second point is, and again, I'm going to use a random example. Let's pick Oxford, but I could pick somewhere else. You know, in somewhere like Oxford, London's another good example. We have far too little housing relative to consumer demand. Far too little housing relative to consumer demand, which, as we know, then drives up prices, which we've already heard from Sienna. People don't like, quite right. Higher house prices drive commutes. That's why London has long commutes. It's because it's very expensive to live near to where you work. So you live miles away because that's where prices are. So, you know, there's some big challenges and questions that we need to grapple with. But partly it's about the kind of nature of the places that we're looking at and what that then means for the decisions that we need to make over time about how we make sure our cities are successful and our urban areas are successful over time. As Chris always says, and he's always right, you know, that will mean different things in different places. And we need to be very mindful about that.
Okay, so let's stick on the Newport example and let's go to you, Paul, because I know of you. And as Jonathan Bayfield has just pointed out, didn't Paul just develop a shopping centre in Newport?
Really a random choice, Andrew.
Was actually, I did not know that. So there we go. Not for the first time, you're going to tell me I'm completely wrong, Paul.
No. Good choice of places, though, because we built a shopping centre in Newport in 2015. It opened, and I own a shopping centre in Newport right next door to it. The previous one, the existing one. But let's not focus on Newport, and I don't mean that being flippant. it is a very good example of the sign of the times, you know, absolutely missing and not having any focal point for city centre retail offer, food and beverage offer in 2003, 2004, opened up, won a competition, built a shopping centre of 250,000 square feet in the town centre, massive improvement in terms of footfall, economic drives, gross value add between 2015, 2018, anchored by a big department store, Debenhams department store, you know, one of their flagship stores. And yes, in that short period of time, and we sold that to an investor. We were a trader developer, so we built it, sold it on to an investor. But suffering significantly now, and the high street now depreciated and fell away yet again. And I think the speed of change, I think change happening is something that we're all trying to cope with at the moment and looking at trends, but the speed of change, I keep telling my team and everybody I talk to, is changing so rapidly in that cycle of 10 years from bust to boom. And this isn't the property cycle that we used to see every 8 years. This is an evolutionary cycle of direction of travel of our urban centres. So we come back to repurposing and what can we do and what are the new options for us? And somebody asked a little while back about on the chat about the planning, the change in planning legislation and sort of the opening up of use clauses. That's fantastic. You know, that helps enormously. It helps a lot of owners to create what I would say is an immediate reaction, not necessarily a long-term solution, but an immediate reaction to what's going on. Lease structures also cause restrictions that make it very difficult to twist and turn with market trends. But at the moment, leases are being thrown out the window every day with CVAs, etc. So landlords do have the ability to take back the properties they own, and they do have the possibility within the lease, within the use clauses, to vary what they're offering. But it doesn't just mean there's something to change your building into overnight. It depends where you're located. It comes back to the location, the region you're in, what else is going on, back to that sort of synergetic development process with your local authority. What plans have they got for bringing more residential? What other job opportunities will there be down the line? It's a very challenging situation. There's no doubt about it. And as I say, viability quite often in many locations is not achievable. And where that's not achievable, what do we find? We find local authorities buying shopping centres that are half empty as the start of their regeneration programme. You know, Sefton's done it already, just picking out places I'm aware of. You know, in Sefton Council in Bootle, there's a limitless list of councils, but they bought recently and in the last couple of years to initiate a regeneration process, and that has to be clearly highlighted against the backdrop of local authorities borrowing to buy investments in other locations where they don't actually have an interest. I'm a great promoter of local authorities using facilities like Public Works Loan Board to acquire key strategic sites for regeneration to improve the location that they are responsible for, versus using those borrowings to go off and buy investments in another location that has nothing to do with their community.
Absolutely. I agree. Chris, did you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that Paul's making, and you know, no matter what it is that we think is the right thing to do, we've got to have the means to finance it. And the argument about PWLB, you know, I think has been well made in respect of only borrowing for your own place, but there are perhaps other financial mechanisms that are missing from a toolkit of local authorities, particularly those larger urban authorities with the capacity to manage them. I'm thinking about things like tax increment financing, the sort of evergreen funds that places like Manchester have been able to get in place, and extending those in a way that actually, you know, if government puts some money in over time, they could probably pay back most, if not all, of that money to government. And so I think in the short to medium term, that is something that we should be looking at very seriously, revisiting those mechanisms that other cities in other countries have access to within the context of a changing local tax base. Because, you know, as you know, business rates pays for a large part of local government finance at the moment, and that is part of the tax base which is experiencing real difficulty. So it is time, I think, for that wider debate about how local taxation operates and how it supports investment into the kinds of development, economy and services that we need to create quality places.
And I might just pick up on it as an extension of that sentence, and it's something I'd like to maybe explore certainly in the next 5 minutes. What do those quality places look like? What do those kind of, you know, what are the use asset types or use classes that are needed, you know, from the built environment to get to those? I know it's not one answer. And we've had a question from Emma around the Newport question. If it's not retail, what is it? Happy whoever wants to pick that up first. I'm sure you'll all have an opinion. Paul,
I feel like it comes to me because it's Newport. I've been caught out today. I have a lot of things to say about Nuneaton and Barnsley and Sheffield, but let's talk about Newport.
Well, you use one of those examples. But if it's an oversupply of retail, then
I'm conscious of time now as well. But just to be very sort of clear, every place is different. It is a very difficult question to answer because obviously every place is constituted with different sorts of criteria and existing makeup. But if I can just take it to a sort of high level, we've got a sort of a new holy trinity within our organisation now in terms of the uses that we are looking to reintroduce to town centres. And they're not unique, people are talking about them already, but cultural, health and education is sort of taking the place of retail. And that sounds crass perhaps and very nice because we look at what retail returns used to be in the good golden years and then compare that to potentially health, culture and education. Well, they were shunned because there was no high level financial return, and that hasn't necessarily changed. But in terms of making our places and these new places we're talking about, bringing back that civic pride, these are some of the cornerstones that are required. And the private investment market is going to have to fill the gaps between that. But these uses are going to drive footfall, bring people back to our centres, whether it's health and community centres, whether it's learning facilities, whether it's theatres, whether it's museums, etc. But it does sound a very soft answer, but those are things that are going to be invested into by local authorities. Those are the things that can come into markets where the market itself isn't strong in office content, for example, and where retail doesn't exist anymore. So for us, that you've got to bring in those cornerstones. Those cornerstones generate footfall. That footfall creates vibrance, creates civic pride. That then creates the chance for the economy to give the best chance for the economy to come alive. And then it needs to go, and the councils do need and have access to lots of different funds. There may need to be clarity on it, like Chris says, but town investment plans at the moment, the future high streets, etc., all the levelling up agenda, those pots need to be brought together and coordinated. And to be honest, the towns and cities that are open for business, that have decent leadership, decent officers, and understanding of these facilities, have a fantastic toolkit, albeit it's still in development at the moment. Sheffield's doing it, Barnsley's doing it, Nuneaton's doing it. These are all places that are taking on investments, mixed use, with our assistance, targeting key projects. And they're varying from 60 million up to 400 million pounds. And they're not unique, but it's got to be based on these new uses. And it's got to be based, residential is extremely important, but that doesn't drive an economy. Jobs drive an economy at the end of the day. So I think that's also an important thing to remember. And people will want to work in town centres. I don't see that changing. And they might want to live in a nicer environment nearer to their work, and that might change some of the patterns of how we work, but we're not going to see a massive move away from people working in cities and towns.
Sienna, is there anything you've learned from kind of your work in terms of kind of any European examples or?
Yeah, so I was actually going to talk to a point that Paul made a while back on the spaces between buildings. We actually did some work looking at public realm and the value of it globally, and looking at a couple of European examples, such as the Place du Marché Saint-Honoré in Paris. There, a large car park was repurposed effectively to allow the public realm, more public realm and better quality public realm. So that enabled the retail values to increase in that local area. And another point on what to do about retail is kind of relates back to the Place du Marché. Retail doesn't have to be how it is or how it has been with long-term leases. and a very similar lineup of tenants. There have been many examples where a more changing lineup of tenants, including more independent retailers, has been very successful in generating footfall. And just over the pandemic, it seems that independent retailers have also been benefiting from a push towards local shops and local shopping. So those are 2 points really, the public realm and changing retail, which I think could answer that question about what to do in the vibrancy of our urban centres.
Paul, let's go back to you.
Yeah, we're getting on my favourite subject now. I know we're near the end, so all I'll say is regional is cool again. Independent retailers are now the new multiples. And when you do have a debate separately one day about retail food and beverage and the food hall concept in markets, you know, there's a whole new world out there, which is very exciting. And this is, you know, we talk about what's the new retail. We'll have a separate debate about that going forward. The only problem around all of that at the moment, though, is monetizing that. And again, for the investor market, finding some way of valuing that in a way that it can be compared to the previous sort of offer and rental structure we had with retail. It's a totally different subject. And I understand for investors it's very sensitive and the whole valuation process is sensitive, but we have to be more flexible. You know, markets are cool again, flexible uses are cool, regional independence, it's fantastic. And that creates place. At the end of the day, that's what's going to make each individual place feel different from sort of the cloning that we've had in the past.
Okay, so if it's okay with you, we'll just do a little bit of a roundup, and really I'll ask for any kind of key conclusions that you want people to take away from this session. If I could start with you, Andrew.
No, I think it's been a great sort of discussion really, and some of the questions that were posed that we addressed, but also some of them we didn't address were fantastically interesting. I suppose, you know, if the subject is the future of cities in a big question sense, then I think, you know, as I've said before at the start, I think we need to those bigger claims that what we've observed in the short run tell us something about the longer term of our cities. I think we should treat with suitable caution at this point. Doesn't mean that they're wrong. They may well be right, but we just need to be cautious, because in a sense, this is a great quote to finish from me, at least. You know, Mike Batty, the esteemed UCL scholar, you know, he says, we can't predict the future of cities, but we can invent them. Right? And he's right in a sense that on many levels, but the decisions we make today are going to be with us for a very long time. You know, remember the decisions that we made in the 1960s when we got obsessed with car ownership and urban motorways, right? And what that did to our cities and is still doing to our cities. It was made for the right reasons, but entirely the wrong decision. And you can see how kind of short run responses to what we've seen through the pandemic could well have quite significant negative effects for our cities, make it harder for them to adapt and respond rather than necessarily easier. I'm rarely one that says, you know, we need to pause and take our time on some of these things, but we might need to in this instance.
Thank you, Andrew. A lot to leave us with there. Chris, thank you.
Yeah, I completely echo those points. I think there are clearly challenges here, but there's potentially a very exciting moment as well, where we could realise some of the ambitions that many of us have shared over recent decades, and just use the knowledge we've got now, really substantial knowledge of what does and does not work in terms of quality placemaking. And I think we should have a kind of collective flight to quality, really, accepting the points that Andrew makes about, you know, no massive kind of U-turns. And that should be based on meeting people's needs. And I think we've tried to do that in a very basic and minimal way. So of course, you've got to have a job, you've got to have a roof over your head. Those are fundamentals. But beyond that, what do we need from our places? What will make us feel a sense of attachment and even, you know, meaning and purpose in the places that we inhabit? So drawing our circle in terms of investigating what people need from their cities in the future more broadly than we have in the past, I think is key.
Thank you very much. We're already seeing numbers drop off. So Sienna and Paul, I will come to you, but if you could keep it short and sweet, please. Sienna?
Okay, so I'll keep it short. I agree with the points that Chris made about spaces needing to meet needs, and those needs are changing. If we do see a rise in home working, then the offices that we do have and that we do invest in need to be better quality, with a focus on not only providing a desk, but also meeting other needs for amenities, potentially green space and wellness. And public realm, I think, will be increasingly important, both in terms of increasing the attractiveness of city centres, but also allowing the decline of retail to be somewhat managed by increasing the attractiveness of those spaces.
Thank you, Sienna and Paul.
Yeah, just keep it short. We've never had government's attention so much focused on this agenda. I think with Brexit and the pandemic, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to make the most of this. I think there's enormous opportunity, and it all comes down to one simple thing in terms of the regions and the different local authorities and towns and cities we're working as leadership. It's as much a golden rule in the public sector as is the private sector. The strong private sector companies that excel have fantastic leadership. The councils that are going to excel are the ones with great officers and strong leadership. There's 300 and some odd, if not 400 councils out there. Sorry for the wrong number if it's not quite right. They're all competing for the same prizes. Leadership is key.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much to the panel. A very engaging discussion. Thank you all for your time, and thanks to those who were able to join us today. There's a few questions that are left over. We'll see if anyone fancies answering them off the back, but there's no. We'll see what we can do about that. But thank you all for your time. Have a great rest of the day, and hopefully see you all soon in real life. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.